Hey everybody, welcome back to A People's Historian, show where we read about half an hour of history together. My name is Jason Kishinev, and we're going to hopefully finish up chapter 9 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Remember, if you like what you hear in this episode, hit the like and subscribe button and that notification bell so you'll be notified about future videos. Let's dig in. With these laws, with the Union Army in the South as protection, and a civilian army of officials in the Freedmen's Bureau to help them, Southern Negroes came forward, voted, formed political organizations, and expressed themselves forcefully on issues important to them. They were hampered in this for several years by Andrew Johnson, vice president under Lincoln, who became president when Lincoln was assassinated at the close of the war. Johnson vetoed bills to help Negroes. He made it easy for Confederate states to come back into the Union without guaranteeing equal rights to blacks. During his presidency, these returned Southern states enacted black codes, which made the freed slaves like serfs, still working the plantations. For instance, Mississippi in 1865 made it illegal for freedmen to rent or lease farmland and provided for them to work under labor contracts which they could not break under penalty of prison. It also provided that the courts could assign black children under 18 who had no parents or whose parents were poor to forced labor called apprenticeships, with punishment for runaways. Andrew Johnson clashed with senators and congressmen who, in some cases for reasons of justice, in others out of political calculation, supported equal rights and voting for the freedmen. These members of Congress succeeded in impeaching Johnson in 1868, using as an excuse that he had violated some minor statute, but the Senate fell one vote short of the 2/3 required to remove him from office. In the presidential election of that year, Republican Ulysses S. Grant was elected, winning by 300,000 votes with 700,000 Negroes voting, and so Johnson was out as an obstacle. Now the Southern states could come back into the Union only by approving the new constitutional amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th. We covered that last episode. Whatever Northern politicians were doing to help their cause, Southern blacks were determined to make the most of their freedom, in spite of their lack of land and resources. A study of blacks in Alabama in the first years after the war by historian Peter Colchin finds that they began immediately asserting their independence of whites, forming their own churches, becoming politically active, strengthening their family ties, trying to educate their children. Colchin disagrees with the contention of some historians that slavery had created a Sambo mentality of submission among blacks. As soon as they were free, these supposedly dependent, childlike Negroes began acting like independent men and women. I think that's Colchin being quoted. Negroes were now elected to Southern state legislatures, although in all these they were a minority, except in the lower house of the South Carolina legislature. A great propaganda campaign was undertaken north and south, one which lasted well into the 20th century in the history textbooks of American schools, to show that blacks were inept, lazy, corrupt, and ruinous to the governments of the South when they were in office. Undoubtedly there was corruption, but one could hardly claim that blacks had invented political conniving, especially in the bizarre climate of financial finagling north and south after the Civil War. It was true that The public debt of South Carolina, $7 million in 1865, went up to $29 million in 1873, 8 years later. But the new legislature introduced free public schools for the first time into the state. Not only were 70,000 Negro children going to school by 1876, where none had gone before, but 50,000 white children were going to school where only 20,000 had attended in 1860. So we're talking 100,000 more kids in school. Black voting in the period after 1869 resulted in 2 Negro members of the U.S. Senate, Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce, both from Mississippi, and 20 congressmen, including 8 from South Carolina, 4 from North Carolina, 3 from Alabama, and 1 each from the other former Confederate states. This list would dwindle rapidly after 1876, the last black left in Congress in 1901. A Columbia University scholar of the 20th century, John Burgess, referred to black Reconstruction as follows: in place of government by the most intelligent and virtuous part of the people for the benefit of the governed, here was government by the most ignorant and vicious part of the population. A black skin means membership into a race of men which has never of itself succeeded in subjecting passion to reason, has never therefore created civilization of any kind. One has to measure against those words the black leaders in the post-war South. For instance, Henry McNeil Turner, who had escaped from peonage on a South Carolina plantation at the age of 15, taught himself to read and write, read law books while a messenger in a lawyer's office in Baltimore, and read medical books while a handyman in a Baltimore medical school, served as a chaplain to a Negro regiment, and then was elected to the first post-war legislature of Georgia. In 1868, the Georgia legislature voted to expel all its Negro members, 2 senators, 25 representatives, and Turner spoke to the Georgia House of Representatives. A black woman graduate student at Atlanta University later brought his speech to light. Mr. Speaker, I wish the members of this House to understand the position that I take. I hold that I am a member of this body. Therefore, sir, I shall neither fawn or cringe before any party, nor stoop to beg them for my rights. I am here to demand my rights, and to hurl thunderbolts at the men who would dare to cross the threshold of my manhood. The scene presented in this House today is one unparalleled in the history of the world. Never in the history of the world has a man been arraigned before a body clothed with legislative, judicial, or executive functions, charged with the offense of being of a darker hue than his fellow men. It has remained for the state of Georgia in the very heart of the 19th century to call a man before the bar and there charge him with an act for which he is no more responsible than for the head which he carries upon his shoulders. The Anglo-Saxon race, sir, is a most surprising one. I was not aware that there was in the character of that race so much cowardice or so much pusillanimity. I tell you, sir, that this is a question which will not die today. This event shall be remembered by posterity for ages yet to come, and while the sun shall continue to climb the hills of heaven. We are told that if black men want to speak, they must speak through white trumpets. If black men want their sentiments expressed, they must be adulterated and sent through white messengers who will quibble and equivocate and evade as rapidly as the pendulum of a clock. The great question, sir, is this: am I a man? If I am such, I claim the rights of a man. Why, sir, though we are not white, we have accomplished much. We have pioneered civilization here. We have built up your country. We have worked in your fields and garnered your harvests for 250 years, and what do we ask of you in return? Do we ask you for compensation for the sweat our fathers bore for you? For the tears you have caused, and the hearts you have broken, and the lives you have curtailed, and the blood you have spilled? Do we ask retaliation? We ask it not. We are willing to let the dead past bury its dead, but we ask you now for our rights. Rights in all caps. Not that he spoke in all caps, but this is all. As black children went to school, they were encouraged by teachers, black and white, to express themselves freely, sometimes in catechism style. The records of a school in Louisville, Kentucky. Teacher says, "Now, children, you don't think white people are any better than you because they have straight hair and white faces." The students say, "No, sir." The teacher says, "No, they are no better, but they are different. They possess great power. They formed this great government. They control this vast country. Now what makes them different from you?" The students say, "Money." The teacher says, "Yes, but what enabled them to obtain it? How did they get money?" And the students say, "Got it off us. Stole it off we all." Black women helped rebuild the post-war South. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, born free in Baltimore, self-supporting from the age of 13, working as a nursemaid, later as an abolitionist lecturer, reader of her own poetry, spoke all through the southern states after the war. She was a feminist, participant in the 1866 Women's Rights Convention, and founder of the National Association of Colored Women. In the 1890s, she wrote the first novel published by a black woman, Iola Leroy, or Shadows Uplifted. In 1878, she described what she had seen and heard recently in the South. An acquaintance of mine who lives in South Carolina and has been engaged in mission work reports that in supporting the family, women are the mainstay, that 2/3 of the truck gardening is done by them in South Carolina, that in the city they are more industrious than the men. When the men lose their work through their political affiliations, the women stand by them and say, "Stand by your principles." Through all the struggles to gain equal rights for blacks, certain black women spoke out on their special situation. Sojourner Truth, at a meeting of the American Equal Rights Association, said, "There is a great stir about colored men getting their rights, but not a word about the colored women. And if colored men get their rights and not colored women, there's, you see, the colored men will be masters over the women, and it will be just as bad as it was before." So I am for keeping the thing going while things are stirring, because if we wait till it is still, it will take a great while to get it going again. I am above 80 years old. It is about time for me to be going. I have been 40 years a slave and 40 years free, and would be here 40 years more to have equal rights for all. I suppose I am kept here because something remains for me to do. I suppose I am yet to help break the chain. I have done a great deal of work, as much as a man, but did not get so much pay. I used to work in the field and bind grain, keeping with the cradler, but men doing no more got twice as much pay. I suppose I am about the only colored woman that goes about to speak for the rights of the colored women. I want to keep the thing stirring now that the ice is cracked. Really dry throat. Sorry. Why I'm apologizing. The constitutional amendments were passed. The laws for racial equality were passed. And the black man began to vote and to hold office. But so long as the Negro remained dependent on privileged whites for work, for the necessities of life, his vote could be bought or taken away by threat of force. Thus, laws calling for equal treatment became meaningless. While Union troops, including colored troops, remained in the South, this process was delayed, but the balance of military powers began to change. The Southern white oligarchy used its economic power to organize the Ku Klux Klan and other terrorist groups. Northern politicians began to weigh the advantage of the political support of impoverished blacks, maintained in voting in office only by force, against the more stable situation of a South returned to white supremacy, accepting Republican dominance in business legislation. It was only a matter of time before blacks would be reduced once again to conditions not far from slavery. Violence began almost immediately with the end of the war. In Memphis, Tennessee, in May of 1866, whites on a rampage of murder killed 46 Negroes, most of them veterans of the Union Army, as well as 2 white sympathizers. 5 Negro women were raped. 90 homes, 12 schools, and 4 churches were burned. In New Orleans, in the summer of 1866, another riot against blacks killed 35 Negroes and 3 whites. Mrs. Sarah Song testified before a congressional investigating committee. Have you been a slave? I have been a slave. What did you see of the rioting? I saw them kill my husband. It was on Tuesday night between 10 and 11 o'clock. He was shot in the head while he was in bed sick. There were between 20 and 30 men. They came into the room, then one stepped back and shot him. He was not a yard from him, but put the pistol to his head and shot him 3 times. Then one of them kicked him and another shot him again when he was down. He never spoke after he fell. They then went running right off and did not come back again. I imagine she's probably crying up a storm while she said that, but I'm not crying. The violence mounted through the late 1860s and early 1870s as the Ku Klux Klan organized raids, lynchings, beatings, burnings. For Kentucky alone, between 1867 and 1871, the National Archives list 116 acts of violence. A sampling. Oh, I wish he wouldn't. A mob visited Harrodsburg in Mercer County to take from jail a man named Robertson, November 14th, 1867. Number 5. Sam Davis hung by a mob in Harrodsburg, May 28th, 1868. Number 6. William Pierce hung by a mob in Christian, July 12th, 1868. George Roger hung by a mob in Bradsfordville, Martin County, July 11th, 1868. Silas Wolford, age 60, badly beaten by disguised mob. Number 109, Negro killed by Ku Klux Klan in Hay County, January 14th, 1871. A Negro blacksmith named Charles Caldwell, born a slave, later elected to the Mississippi Senate and known as a notorious and turbulent Negro by whites. That was in quotations, notorious and turbulent Negro, was shot at by the son of a white Mississippi judge in 1868. Caldwell fired back and killed the man. Tried by an all-white jury, he argued self-defense and was acquitted. The first Negro to kill a white in Mississippi and go free after a trial. But on Christmas Day, 1873, Caldwell was shot to death by a white gang. It was a sign the old white rulers were taking back political power in Mississippi and everywhere else in the South. As white violence rose in the 1870s, the national government, even under President Grant, became less enthusiastic about defending blacks, and certainly not prepared to arm them. The Supreme Court played its gyroscopic role of pulling the other branches of government back to more conservative directions when they went too far. It began interpreting the 14th Amendment, passed presumably for racial equality, in a way that made it impotent for this purpose. In 1883, the Civil Rights Act of 1875, outlawing discrimination against Negroes using public facilities, was nullified by the Supreme Court, which said individual invasion of individual rights is not the subject matter of the amendment. The 14th Amendment, it said, was aimed at state action only. No state shall. A remarkable dissent was written by Supreme Court Justice John Harlan, himself a former slave owner in Kentucky, who said there was constitutional justification for banning private discrimination. He noted that the 13th Amendment, which banned slavery, applied to individual plantation owners, not just the state. He then argued that discrimination was a badge of slavery and similarly outlawable. He pointed also to the first clause of the 14th Amendment, saying that anyone born in the United States was a citizen, and to the clause in Article 4, Section 2, saying the citizens of each state shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states. Harlan was fighting a force greater than logic or justice. The mood of the courts reflected a new coalition of northern industrialists and southern businessmen planters. The culmination of this mood came in the decision of 1896, Plessy v. Ferguson, when the court ruled that a railroad could segregate black and white if the segregated facilities were equal. The object of the amendment was undoubtedly to enforce the absolute equality of the two races before the law, but in the nature of things it could not have been intended to abolish distinctions based upon color, or to enforce social as distinguished from political equality, or a commingling of the two races upon terms unsatisfactory to either. Commingling? It's a weird word. Harlan again dissented. Our Constitution is colorblind. That was a quote. Short quote, but it was a quote. It was the year 1877 that spelled out clearly and dramatically what was happening. When the year opened, the presidential election of the past November was in bitter dispute. The Democratic candidate, Samuel Tilden, had 184 votes and needed one more to be elected. His popular vote was greater by 250,000. The Republican candidate, Rutherford Hayes, had 166 electoral votes. 3 states not yet counted had a total of 19 electoral votes. If Hayes could get all of those, he would have 185 and be president. This is what his managers proceeded to arrange. They made concessions to the Democratic Party and the white South, including an agreement to remove Union troops from the South, the last military obstacle to the reestablishment of white supremacy there. Northern political and economic interests needed powerful allies and stability in the face of national crisis. The country had been in economic depression since 1873, and by 1877 farmers and workers were beginning to rebel. As C. Van Woodward puts it in his History of the 1877 Compromise, Reunion and Reaction, it was a depression year, the worst year of the severest depression yet experienced. In the East, labor and the unemployed, I think there was a comma there, that in the East, labor and the unemployed were in a bitter and violent temper. Out west, a tide of agrarian radicalism was rising. From both east and west came threats against the elaborate structure of protective tariffs, national banks, railroad subsidies, and monetary arrangements upon which the new economic order was founded. It was a time for reconciliation between Southern and Northern elites. Woodward asks, could the South be induced to combine with the Northern conservatives and become a prop instead of a menace to the new capitalist order? With billions of dollars worth of slaves gone, the wealth of the old South was wiped out. They now looked to the national government for help, credit, subsidies, flood control projects. The United States in 1865 had spent $103 million, 294,501. Let me say that again. That was weird. $103,294,501 on public works. I'm sorry, I think I'm tired. But the South received only $9,469,363. For instance, while Ohio got over $1 million, Kentucky, her neighbor south of the river, got $25,000. While Maine got $3 million, Mississippi got $136,000. While $83 million had been given to subsidize the Union Pacific and Central Pacific railroads, thus creating a transcontinental railroad through the North, there was no such subsidy for the South. So one of the things the South looked for was federal aid to the Texas and Pacific Railroad. Woodward says, by means of appropriations, subsidies, grants, and bonds, such as Congress had so lavishly showered upon capitalist enterprise in the North, the South might yet mind its fortunes, or at any rate the fortunes of a privileged elite. These privileges were sought with the backing of poor white farmers brought into the new alliance against blacks. The farmers wanted railroads, harbor improvements, flood control, and of course, land, not knowing yet how these would be used not to help them, but to exploit them. We'll learn about that in a later chapter, where the railroad monopolies just charge whatever they want to these farmers, and you'll read that later. For example, as the first act of the new North-South capitalist cooperation, the Southern Homestead Act, which had reserved all federal lands, 1/3 of the area of Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, for farmers who would work the land, was repealed. This enabled absentee speculators and lumbermen to move in and buy up much of this land. And so the deal was made. Shoot. Sorry. The proper committee was set up by both houses of Congress to decide where the electoral votes would go. The decision was they belonged to Hayes, and he was now president. As Woodward sums up, the Compromise of 1877 did not restore the old order in the South. It did assure the dominant whites political autonomy and non-intervention in matters of race policy, and promised them a share in the blessings of the new economic order. In return, the South became, in effect, a satellite of the dominant region. And you know what? We are right on half an hour, and we have several more pages, so I'm going to finish there, and we'll have to catch the end of the chapter in the next episode, which will be a really, really short episode. So I hope you enjoyed the reading. Hit the like and subscribe button and the notification bell. See you next time. Thanks for joining me.